Welcome to the Women in Technology session on managing challenging interactions in the technology workplace. Every woman at some point in her working career is going to encounter challenging interactions with colleagues in the workplace. We're using the term challenging interactions as kind of an umbrella term to cover an entire spectrum of difficult behaviors. These include everything from discrimination and prejudice to harassment and sexual harassment, bullying, and at the extreme end of this continuum, violence. What we're going to do in this session is, first of all, provide you with a lot of information. So we'll look at definitions and concepts, and then we'll also look at legislation that's in place that cover this set of challenging interactions. Then we're going to give you strategies for how to deal with these interactions should they occur to you in your workplace. So at the end of this session, we hope to have you very prepared to deal with any type of challenging interaction that you might encounter in the workplace so that these interactions don't derail your career or create unnecessary roadblocks to your career. So that's what we have in store for you. We're going to start the session by taking a look at why the behaviors of our coworkers or our colleagues does actually matter when it comes to our own careers. Then we're going to walk you through definitions of the different types of behaviors that we've grouped under this overall term, challenging interactions. Next, we'll provide you with just a basic strategy that you can use for managing any of these interactions, regardless of where they fall on this spectrum. So there's just a basic strategy that you always want to put into play. Then we'll take a look at a couple of more specific strategies. The first one is a communication strategy called the STOP technique. And then the second strategy is just being assertive. So we'll look at different components that go into being assertive when it comes to this challenging behavior. Once we've looked at these basic strategies that you can use for dealing with challenging interactions in the workplace, we're going to go back and take a look at 3 of these interactions in a little bit more detail. And so we're going to look at workplace harassment, workplace sexual harassment, and workplace violence in a bit more detail. Once we've looked at that, then we're going to go back to another general strategy, and this is creating a safe work environment. So we're going to backtrack and take a look at one more strategy that can hit all of these interactions, and that is how do we create a safe, comfortable work environment for everyone. Then we're going to put you to work, as we always do. We'd like you to develop a personal action plan that you can use in order to process this information and put this information into practice in your current situation. And finally, we'll wrap up with a quick look at the resources and references that we use to develop this session. So let's get started. Think that at the end of the day it doesn't matter how other people behave in the workplace. You're just going to go into the workplace and do your job, and whatever other people choose to do, that's their business. Well, that would be nice, except unfortunately there are certain individuals that we will encounter over the course of our careers that decide that it's not okay for you to just do your job. They're going to behave in such a way that impedes your ability to do your job. So it is actually important that you be aware, first of all, of the different types of behavior that can affect you just doing your job, and also how to deal with that so that it has a minimal impact on your career. So there's a lot of different ways that other people's behavior can actually affect you doing your job. Let's take a look at what some of these are. At the very least, someone's challenging behavior towards you is going to undermine your confidence. So if someone is continually, for example, making put-downs about you or insulting you, that's going to, over time, undermine your confidence, regardless of how much you try and block it out. Then there are more consequences depending on the severity of the behavior. So someone's behavior in the workplace might also decrease your ability to get your job done. They may distract you, take away from the time that you can commit to your job. Someone's behavior may increase your stress level to the point where you become ineffective in the workplace. Because when you have one of these challenging behaviors directed at you, your stress level does go way up. It can also impede your career. So, for example, it can impede your ability to get promotions and raises and just generally increase the level of responsibility and authority that you have within the company. And that has a severe impact on your career. On the very extreme end of the impact that someone's challenging behavior can have on you as you try to do your job is this person can take a job which would otherwise be very safe and make it dangerous. So it can actually be dangerous for you to be in the workplace. And even just as extreme, that person's behavior can cause you to make the decision that at the end of the day, this job is not worth it, and you are going to leave and go to another company. So these are the most extreme outcomes that can occur when someone directs his or her challenging behavior at you in the workplace. Before we delve into what these challenging behaviors look like and what they're called, it's really important to put on the table one caveat. We can't control ever how other people behave. How other people behave is a decision they make. What we can control, however, is our reaction to how they behave and how we manage that reaction. So this session is not based upon the premise that, okay, hey, we can control how other people behave towards us. We can't. That is their responsibility and that is their decision. What we can control is how we manage our reaction to their behavior and how we manage what we do as a result of their behavior. That's the entire premise of this session. Throughout our careers, we're going to encounter an entire range or spectrum of challenging workplace behaviors or workplace interactions. And this ranges from everything from the mildly irritating, so someone talks too much and drives us crazy, all the way up to someone's behavior literally puts our lives in danger. So there's this whole spectrum of behaviors that fall under this umbrella term of challenging interactions. This session obviously is going to focus on the more severe of those behaviors. We're not going to talk about how to handle a colleague who talks too much, because you just have to figure that one out. But we are going to look at the behaviors that really can severely impact our careers. There is one caveat that comes with all of the behaviors that we're going to describe and the definitions we'll put on them. And this is that very often, not all the time, but very often, whether a behavior is challenging or not is very much in the eye of the beholder. So the person who's the target or the receiver of the behavior may perceive it one way or she may perceive it another way. So for example, a colleague might compliment you on your hairstyle or your outfit choice for the day. Let's choose something very simple. And you, based on your history with this person and based on how this person has dealt with you in the past and your understanding of his or her behavior, you might perceive this as, just, hey, it's a benign compliment. There's nothing wrong with that. Or you might perceive it as sexual harassment. So behaviors are very much in the eye of the beholder. Not all the time. Obviously, if someone threatens your life, that's pretty clear. There's nothing gray about that. But very much many of these behaviors, it's in the eye of the beholder. And one of the things we'll give you is just a series of questions to walk yourself through if you're not sure what kind of behavior you're dealing with and whether you should take action on that behavior. So that this will kind of help you solidify in your own mind what it is you're dealing with and what it is you're perceiving. But do keep in mind that very often some of these behaviors are in the eye of the beholder. So two people might be the target of the same behavior but might perceive it very differently. The first type of challenging behavior that we'll describe is discrimination. So discrimination is a decision in favor of an individual or against that individual, not based on that individual's merit, but based upon a group or a category to which that individual very clearly belongs. So discrimination can be based on a wide variety of characteristics or groupings. And the Ontario Human Rights Code defines these different categories. So I'll just list off some of them, but all of them are listed on your handout. So there can be discrimination based on race, so how you look, what race it looks like that you belong to, your age, your gender preference, any disability that you may or may not appear to have, and marital status. So these are just a few examples. All of the categories for discrimination that are official and legal, or illegal, let's put it that way, as defined in the Ontario Human Rights Code are listed in your handout. Here's an example of discrimination. So two people are interviewing for the same position, but one person is clearly more suitable for the position based on merit. So this person has more education, more work experience, and say more positive performance appraisals. But the other individual gets this position, and it appears that this other person got the position based on belonging to one of these particular favorable groups, and the other person didn't get the position because she belongs to some group that is not in favor or doesn't have as much power within that organization. So that's an example of clear-cut discrimination. Someone who's clearly more qualified for the job doesn't get it because she belongs to a particular group that has less power or less prestige than the other individual who interviewed for the same position. As I mentioned, discrimination is covered legally under the Ontario Human Rights Code and at the federal level under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. We've given you these documents, these pieces of legislation, in the reference list at the end of your handout, so if you really want to delve into this more, and I suggest you do, take a look at those resources. The next behavior we'll define is harassment. Harassment is an unwanted, that's a key word, unwanted, constant, continual, or persistent, these are also keywords, behavior that is directed at a specific person that person finds irritating, frustrating, distracting, insulting, and so on. So the key ideas in harassment, first of all, it's unwanted, and the target has very clearly said, I don't want this happening, stop. And then it's also constant or persistent, so it's not a single behavior. Harassment is not doing something one time. Harassment is the same behavior over and over and over and over again. Harassment is covered legally under the Ontario Occupational Health and Safety Act. So the definitions of harassment are in there, and employer responsibilities are in there, and employee responsibilities are in there. So if you want to delve into this in more detail, take a look at this piece of legislation. And once again, the links for the legislation are provided in the resource and references section. Here's a brief example of harassment to demonstrate unwanted and persistent. So your desk is located next to a colleague's desk, and in order to get to your desk, you have to pass by your colleague's desk. And your colleague decides that it's going to be entertaining to try and trip you every single time you walk by his or her desk. So he, let's call it a he sticks his foot out every time you go by, and sometimes you manage to see it and you don't trip, and sometimes you end up tripping and you get bruises and so on. So this is an example. It's a clearly unwanted behavior. Who would want to be tripped every time they go to their desk? And it's persistent because it happens every single time you pass by that desk. Bullying is a stronger form of harassment. It's similar to harassment in that it's unwanted and it's persistent or constant. So bullying can be anything from insults and put-downs, being very argumentative, being very sarcastic, being very physically intimidating, so invading someone's physical space and trying to stare them down. And the other piece of bullying is that it's designed to be intimidating. So a bully feels like he or she is stronger than the person being bullied, so the person being targeted by the bullying behavior is perceived as being weaker. And so the bully's sole objective is really to intimidate that person, make that person feel powerless. So that's bullying, slightly stronger and slightly more destructive than harassment. Sexual harassment is harassment, so once again it's unwanted and it's continuous, but it has a sexual intent. And there's a couple of other pieces to sexual harassment as well. Sexual harassment usually comes from an individual who has power over the target individual. So it could be a manager, for example, sexually harassing an employee. So it's usually in that situation, but not always. And then there's another twist usually to sexual harassment, and that is that if the person being targeted by the sexual harassment doesn't comply, then she stands to have severe employment consequences. For example, she might not get a promotion or she might get fired. But if she does comply, she will get the promotion and she will keep her job. So there are a few other twists there to sexual harassment, but once again, it's unwanted or unwelcome behavior, and it's repeated behavior, this time with sexual intent behind it. A classic example of sexual harassment is an employer who asks an employee out on a date, and not just once, but multiple times. and just doesn't stop saying, hey, what are you doing on Friday night? Would you like to go out on a date? And then there's an implication, you know what, if you go out on a date with me, I'll get you that promotion. I know you really want it. Or if you go out on a date with me, you know, we've got some job cuts coming up and I'll take you off the list of, you know, people who are going to have their jobs cut if you go out on a date with me. So that's just a very basic explanation or basic example of sexual harassment. Obviously, it covers the whole range from commenting on someone's appearance to asking them out on a date to threatening and so on. We will delve into sexual harassment in more detail later in the session. We'll give you more definitions and examples and also more strategies very specific to this type of challenging behavior in terms of how to handle it. Aggression is overt or suppressed hostility, and aggression results from an individual feeling frustrated, either because his or her power has been contained or curtailed. He or she might feel that an injustice has been done, or the person might just behave this way because it's part of their personality makeup. And aggression can be either directed at another person, so if I'm being aggressive towards you, I'm directing it at you, or it may be directed towards the individual himself or herself, so if I'm being aggressive, I might direct it back at myself and hurt myself. So aggression can take a few different forms. It can just be verbal, so the person can just be very, very verbally aggressive. It can be a physical invasion of personal space once again, and it can degenerate all the way into violent contact where there's physical injury, and it can also cause emotional injury. Microaggression is kind of a smaller version of aggression. So microaggression is similar to harassment in that it's a series of behaviors that just are constant or continual. And these behaviors in and of themselves aren't harmful. But over time, they have an impact, either a physical impact or an emotional impact. So for example, having somebody insult you on a daily basis, it's harassment, but it's also microaggression because over time, those insults, they have an effect on you and they make you feel less confident or less secure in and of yourself. So microaggression is this series of smaller behaviors that kind of add up or accumulate over time in terms of their damage. The threat of violence is the perception on the part of a target individual that at some point in the near future, a colleague is going to be violent. So a threat of violence can be conveyed either verbally or in writing, so in spoken language or in writing or with nonverbal communication. So an example of a threat of violence is simply someone saying, you know what, I'm going to kill you, or I'm going to hit you next time you do that. And so the person who's being targeted by that threat of violence feels obviously threatened and feels that, you know what, there's a high percentage or a high probability that in the future there is going to be violence directed at me. Violence is rough physical force that is directed at an individual that causes injury. And that injury can either be physical injury or emotional injury. An example of violence is somebody hitting you. So they take their hand and they hit you on the head, basically. That's violence. Violence is covered legally under the Ontario Occupational Health and Safety Act. A special amendment was added in 2010 specifically to address workplace violence. So if you want to read up on this, you'll see the link for this particular amendment dealing with workplace violence in the resources and references section. And we'll also be dealing with this once again later in the session. There are other challenging types of behavior out there, and we can't unfortunately spend time defining all of them. But other challenging behavior that you might have directed at you include gossiping, backstabbing, emotional manipulation, all of these nasty, I call them nasty because I really don't like these, what we call passive-aggressive behaviors. So the person is attacking you, but they're doing it indirectly. So gossip, backstabbing, emotional manipulation, these are all passive-aggressive behaviors that you also have to watch out for. There's one final thing that's important to mention before we move on from the definitions, and that is that these challenging workplace behaviors, they are not always coming from a man towards a woman. So the behavior is not always men directing this behavior towards women. These behaviors can come from women and be directed towards women, and they can come from women and be directed towards men. They can also be coming from one individual towards one individual, from more than one individual to one individual, and from one group to another group. So there are a lot of different forms that these interactions take, because these interactions are not restricted to one particular gender, men, towards another particular gender, women. These are just behaviors that all people direct at all people. How do we manage these challenging workplace behaviors? Because believe me, they are challenging. I've been on the receiving end of a few of these, and they are not pleasant. They can make your work life a nightmare. So there is one basic strategy that we're going to give you, and this is your starting point. Regardless of which behavior it is and where it falls on this whole spectrum of behaviors, there is a starting point for a basic strategy to use in order to start to manage this situation. The first thing you want to do if you suspect you're being targeted by one of these behaviors is to figure out what behavior it is. So take a look at the definitions that we've given you and identify, are you being targeted with discrimination? Are you being targeted with harassment? Are you being targeted with sexual harassment? So first of all, find out what type of behavior it is that you're being targeted with. The second thing you want to do is document the behavior. Have a written document that you create that indicates all of the details of the behavior. So who is involved, when did it happen, so dates and time, what was said, what was done, were there any witnesses? And the other thing you want to document is, how did you feel when you were targeted with this behavior, and how did this impact your performance in the workplace? The next thing you want to do is find out what your company policy is with respect to this particular type of behavior. So in your company's human resources manual, it should spell out their policies with respect to these behaviors. So find out what those policies are. Also, familiarize yourself with the legislation with respect to these policies. Use those resources we've given you that take you directly to that legislation. So know what the policies are and know what the legislation is. If you feel that the person who is targeting you with this behavior is not necessarily malicious and doesn't have an injurious intent with respect to the behavior, he or she is just doing this behavior and not thinking it through. If that's the situation, your next step is going to be to talk to the person to try and get them to stop that behavior. So have that conversation with a colleague present, so get a third party in there. And what you want to do is sit down with the person, describe the behavior, describe how it makes you feel, and then very clearly and assertively ask this person to stop. And in the next section of the presentation, we give you a couple of strategies to use for this meeting. We give you a couple of techniques so that you can clearly communicate to this individual, I don't like this behavior, I don't want it, and I want it to stop. So that's your next step. If the person persists in the behavior after your conversation, have one more quick conversation and say, I don't appreciate this, I asked you to stop this behavior, it is not appropriate that you are continuing this behavior. The final step is to activate your company's procedures with respect to behavior that is inappropriate for the workplace. So if the individual you're dealing with persists in that behavior, and despite your best efforts to say enough, then it's time to bring your company procedures into play. And the other thing you need to do is also bring the law into play. So whatever the law legally allows you to do, you can also bring that into play as well to make sure that this behavior stops. There are just a couple of other things I want to say when it comes to a basic strategy in order to shut down behavior that you don't want that's targeted at you in the workplace. The first one is the steps we've just gone through, they work for behavior obviously that doesn't threaten your safety. So if someone's behavior threatens your safety or your health, obviously you're not going to go through these steps and say, oh, by the way, this behavior is unacceptable and so on. So for example, if you're the target of violence, you're not going to go through these steps. You're going to go directly to activating what you can do within your rights, within the company's procedures, and also within the law. So the steps we've gone through, these are for behaviors that don't endanger you. If you're in danger, it's an urgent situation, and you just go directly to the law and to your company's procedures. So that's point number one. You're going to have another factor in the back of your mind when you're deciding how to activate or whether to activate this basic strategy. And this is whether you think that the behavior that's targeted at you will be a one-time situation. And this, by one-time situation, I mean you're at a company gathering and there's an off-site, for example, and you're being targeted with inappropriate behavior by someone who's a guest at that gathering, and you don't foresee ever having to cross paths with that person again. Probably you're not going to initiate the strategies that we've talked about or the steps that we've talked about. In that situation, quite frankly, the best strategy is just to get yourself out of the situation. So if you know that that person's never going to cross paths with you again, you just get out of the situation. So either leave the gathering or get a colleague to help you create just a buffer between yourself and that person and just keep that person away from you. So this is a strategy just if it's a one-time situation and you know you're never going to see this person again, and obviously you're not in any danger, so it's just an irritating or inappropriate behavior, not a dangerous behavior. So that's another thing to keep in mind. And finally, there is one other general strategy to keep in mind, and this is if you've tried all of these strategies, so you've gone through talking to the individual, you've gone through your company's procedures, you've activated your rights under the law, and the behavior still exists and it's impacting your career, your ability to do your job, your stress level, and so on, the ultimate last option that you have is to leave and find another organization that has a friendlier and a safer work environment. So always keep in the back of your mind that just leaving is an option. That's not the first option you should activate, but you always know that that's your walk-away position, literally and figuratively, is that if you activate all these procedures and you still can't get that behavior to stop, or the organization doesn't get that behavior to stop, or the law doesn't get that behavior to stop, then you walk away because you have other options out there. You find them, you find yourself a safe, comfortable, and rewarding workplace. The next basic strategy I'm going to walk you through is a communication strategy. So you can use this when you're communicating directly to the person who's targeting you with the behavior. You're having that conversation saying, hey, I don't like your behavior and I want it to stop. So this is a communication technique. So it's called the STOP technique, S-T-O-P. And unfortunately, I don't know where this comes from. It's not mine. It was in my notes, and unfortunately, I don't know the reference for it. So I'm just going to put it on the record. This is not mine, but it's a great technique. So I'll walk you through the STOP technique. The S in the STOP technique stands for state. So the very first thing you're going to do is state the behavior that is inappropriate, and you're going to state it clearly, concisely, and objectively. You're identifying, here's the behavior that we're talking about. So the S is for state. Here's an example, and it's only part of a sentence. It's not the complete sentence. Bob. So you're going to use the person's name, and for some reason I always like the word Bob. No offense to the Bobs out there, but that always comes to mind. So Bob, when you call my idea stupid in the meeting, so what I've done is I've identified the person by name and I've identified the behavior. So that's your S. The T stands for tell. So you're going to tell the perpetrator exactly how you feel as a result of his or her behavior. You're going to do this factually and clearly, but you are talking about emotion here. How do you feel when the person targets you with this particular behavior? That's the T, tell. Continuing on with our example with Bob, here's the T. It hurt my feelings and made me feel devalued in front of my colleagues or in front of our colleagues. So that's your tell in the example. The O stands for options. So you're going to offer the perpetrator options for what he or she can do instead of targeting you with that inappropriate behavior. So don't do this, but here's an idea of what you can do. Here's the O with our Bob example. If you can't understand the value of my ideas, it would be more appropriate and more respectful if you simply asked me to explain them further. So that's our O. And finally, the P. The P stands for positive results. Conclude your statement by telling the perpetrator what the positive outcome of their behavior change will be. It comes down to what's in it for me. So tell the perpetrator, here's what's in it for you if this behavior changes. So here's the positive outcome that will happen if you change the behavior. So here's the final piece of our example with Bob. You're going to say to Bob for the P, I feel this would really improve our working relationship, and it would also improve the overall tone of our meetings. So that's what's in it for Bob. He gets a better working relationship and the meetings have a better tone, so they're just more enjoyable for everyone, including Bob. Here's a quick recap of the STOP technique. S is state, T is tell, O is options, and P is positive results. There are a few things to keep in mind when you're using the stop technique, or actually before you use the stop technique. This is not something that you can just pull off the top of your head. It's something you have to think through. So the first thing to think about is take some time to plan what you're going to say. So plan what your S is going to be, plan your T, plan your O, and plan your P. So plan this whole thing out. If you have to, write it down and then practice it. The second thing to think about is don't do this alone. So don't have this communication with the perpetrator on your own. That just makes you more vulnerable. So pull in a colleague, just say, I really need a quick favor. Can you just sit in on this conversation with Bob while I take him through some things that I would really appreciate him changing? I would just appreciate you being an objective set of eyes and objective set of ears. So that's the conversation you have with a colleague in order to make sure someone else is sitting in on this conversation. If the perpetrator doesn't stop once you've used the stop technique once, do it again. Give him or her another chance to really listen to you and make the changes that you want to see happen. So try it again if it doesn't work the first time. Sometimes people just take a little bit of time to change. But don't try it and try it and try it and try it. Don't just keep hitting your head against a brick wall. If you've tried it twice and the person still doesn't change, now it's time to activate your company policies and the law if it comes into play as well. So try the stop technique a couple of times. If that doesn't work, you know what? They're not listening to you. You need to bring in your company. The next strategy to keep in mind when you're managing challenging interactions in the workplace is the strategy of being assertive, so having assertive communication. When you use assertive communication, it actually can shut down the inappropriate behavior, or it can actually stop the inappropriate behavior from happening in the first place. So being assertive actually can stop you being the target of this behavior in the first place. In order to be assertive, you also need to know what not to be in order to be assertive. So you don't want to be passive, you don't want to be passive-aggressive, you don't want to be aggressive, you want to be assertive. So we're just going to quickly walk through definitions of these terms so that you know what assertiveness is not, and then you can figure out in your own mind what assertiveness is. Passive is when an individual avoids conflict altogether and doesn't put forward his or her needs at all. So in the situation where we have a challenging interaction in the workplace, a passive individual literally just lets the behavior keep happening. And that is not a healthy strategy to use. So you don't want to be passive. This behavior is inappropriate. Don't let it keep happening. Even if it means you have to face conflict, even if it means you have to put your wants and needs out there, that's what you have to do. So don't be passive. Don't let this behavior just keep happening. The opposite of passive is aggressive. So someone who's aggressive actually enjoys conflict. So he or she finds the competition that comes with conflict invigorating, and this person needs to win at all costs. So someone who's aggressive will invade personal space, will yell, can get very verbally abusive. There can be a threat of violence in there as well. Whatever it takes in order to win, that's what this person will do. So that's the opposite of passive, and you don't want to go there either, because this will put you in the position of actually replicating the behavior that you're targeted with. So that doesn't solve the problem either. There's a third behavior that you don't want to do, and this is passive-aggressive behavior. As the name implies, it's a combination of passiveness and aggressiveness. So the passive part is a passive-aggressive person doesn't deal with conflict directly. So the conflict is still avoided and the person doesn't put forward his or her needs. But behind the scenes, or behind your back, this person is actively engaging in that conflict, trying to undermine you, trying to compete with you without directly competing against you. So passive-aggressive behavior doesn't get you anywhere either. So it's not behavior that you want to engage in order to try and resolve these challenging interactions that you have in the workplace. You don't want to be passive, you don't want to be aggressive, and you don't want to be passive-aggressive. So what do you want to be? You want to be assertive. Assertive means that you confidently and directly say, here's what I need, or here are my rights, or here's what I want. You don't apologize for saying that, and you're not timid or shy or reserved about it. You're just saying, I'm a human being, this is my right, and I would appreciate you behaving appropriately. So that's assertive, directly and clearly stating what you need and what you want. Here are some things to keep in mind when you're communicating assertively and when you're assertively saying to someone, no, I want you to stop this behavior. So the first thing to keep in mind is make direct eye contact. So look directly at the person in the eye. Don't look to the side, don't look above, don't look below, look directly at them. Make eye contact. The second thing is to be aware of your posture. So you want to stand up straight and be confident. Trying to be assertive like this, all hunched over and trying to hide and not take up much personal space, it doesn't work. So claim your space, stand up, shoulders back, not too far obviously, but just stand up straight. Imagine you've got this line right through the middle and someone's pulling up. That's what confident posture looks like. The next thing to keep in mind is to plan. Once again, don't try and pull this off the top of your head. Plan the conversation beforehand. If you have to write it down, do that. If you have to rehearse it and practice it, do that. Don't try and wing this kind of conversation. You won't be successful. And next, don't apologize. Don't start your conversation off with, I'm really sorry to bother you. I know you're really busy and I won't take up too much time, but I'm sorry, I really would like to talk to you about something. That does not say assertive. That says someone who is not confident. What you want to do is just say, I'd like to talk to you about something. Okay? Don't apologize. You're not the person who should be apologizing in this situation because you're not the person behaving inappropriately. Along the same lines as don't apologize, don't be defensive. You have every right to ask this person to stop behaving inappropriately towards you, so don't get defensive. The next thing to keep in mind is a really important one, and this kind of revolutionized how I personally dealt with inappropriate behavior. Target the problem, not the person. So the problem is that there's this inappropriate behavior being directed at you. So talk about the problem. Don't talk about the person. So don't say to the person, oh, you're an idiot or you're stupid. Don't attack that person directly. Talk about the problem. So separate the problem, which is the inappropriate behavior, from the person. Stand your ground. Don't let this person push you around. If the person says, oh, you're exaggerating things, or, oh, that's not important, and you're reading too much into this, stand your ground and say, you know what, that may be, but this is important to me. I don't appreciate this behavior and I want it to stop. So stand your ground. Don't let yourself be pushed around, and do so objectively, unemotionally, and non-defensively. And finally, don't go into any conversation about the inappropriate behavior needing to be liked. When you push someone to change their behavior, that person might react negatively. That's just the nature of the game. That's how human beings often react. So don't need to be liked. This is not about whether people like you or don't like you. This is about the fact that you have inappropriate behavior being directed at you and it needs to stop. So don't worry about being liked. That's not the issue. Behaving assertively can be very, very powerful. As I stated when we started talking about assertiveness, it can both shut down inappropriate behavior, but equally importantly, it can actually stop you from being the target of inappropriate behavior in the first place. Unfortunately, human beings, being who they are, very often they target people they perceive to be the weak link. So if you're behaving passively, for example, that's like walking around with a bullseye on your back. So when you behave assertively, that tells people, you know what, you're a confident person and you will stand up for yourself if you have to. So, you know what, don't waste the energy in targeting me in the first place. So assertive behavior or assertiveness is a really, really powerful strategy to use every single day in the workplace. We're going to take a few minutes to talk a little bit more about workplace harassment. Workplace harassment is one of the inappropriate behaviors or challenging behaviors that's actually covered under the law. And it's covered under the Occupational Health and Safety Act in Ontario. So we're going to walk through what the Act has to say when it comes to workplace harassment. And if you have time after this session, take a look online at the actual legislation. We provided you with the links in the resources section. So really familiarize yourself with the legislation, the definitions, and so on, so that if you are a target of this type of behavior, you know how to manage it based on the law. So the law under the Occupational Health and Safety Act actually spells out a very clear definition of workplace harassment. And all of the criteria for this definition have to be present in order for the law to consider the behavior to be workplace harassment. So we'll go through each of these criteria just to make sure that you're clear on them. The first criteria that has to be true in order for behavior in the workplace to be classified as harassment under the law is that it has to be improper and offensive. And then the second criteria is that it has to be directed at one specific individual. It can't just be directed at an entire staff, for example. It's directed at one specific individual, The next criteria is that the individual has to feel offended or harmed in some way by the behavior, whether they feel intimidated, demeaned, insulted, and so on. So there has to be some negative effect on that individual. Then it starts to get into a little bit grayer area. The perpetrator of the behavior has to be aware or has to have known that his or her behavior is not appropriate in the workplace and would cause harm. So there has to be a knowledge on the part of the perpetrator that this is inappropriate and harmful and offensive behavior. Next, the behavior has to have occurred in the workplace or at an event or a location related to work. So if the work took someone off site, for example, and the behavior occurred there, it would still fall under workplace harassment. So it has to be occurring at a location somehow related to the work that the individuals engage in. And finally, there has to have been either a series of events, so a series of behaviors that were harassing, or one very severe incident that had a lasting impact on the individual. So either through this series of events or one very severe incident, the individual has been harmed in a lasting way, in some way. There is one other criterion, that's a time frame. In order for workplace harassment to fall under the law, it has to be reported within 12 months of its occurrence. So there's kind of a statute of limitations on reporting workplace harassment. Based on this set of criteria under the law, we can generate a series of questions to kind of ask ourselves in order to determine, okay, am I being targeted with workplace harassment? And then if you can answer yes to these questions, then you have a pretty good idea that, okay, the behavior that's being directed at you does constitute workplace harassment. So let's walk through these questions. Did the behavior take place in the workplace or in a work-related context? Was the behavior improper? Was the behavior directed at me? Was I offended by the behavior? Was this the first incident or is it a series of incidents? What is my work relationship with this individual? What impact and or consequences did this incident or series of incidents have on me, physically, emotionally, and professionally? There are consequences under the law for individuals who are found to have been harassing someone in the workplace. And these consequences are put into play through an organization, through a company, and guided by the law. So the consequences to an individual who is found to have been harassing another individual in the workplace, they range from anything from being disciplined to having to apologize to the individual to all the way down to getting fired, getting demoted, and things like that. So the consequences can be quite severe if an individual is found to be harassing another individual in the workplace. If you're the target of this behavior, you want to know the law and know what your company needs to do to support you under the law. Now let's take a look at sexual harassment in the workplace in more depth. The last survey that really delved into the issue of sexual harassment in the workplace was conducted way back in 1993. And this survey found that 23% of women who were working had experienced sexual harassment in some form or another at some point in their working life. So this is a pretty staggering number when you look at it. Unfortunately, there is no updated data, so a similar extensive survey has not been conducted recently. But it's safe to say that sexual harassment is a persistent issue in the workplace. It's not something that disappeared overnight, and so it's certainly an issue that we need to be aware of and we need to know how to handle as women in the workplace. The term sexual harassment actually handles a spectrum or continuum of behaviors, and these behaviors can be categorized into 5 categories, so we can kind of get a sense of what sexual harassment entails or how it's being defined. So we'll walk through each of these 5 categories, because the first step in managing sexual harassment, if you are the target of it, is to first of all understand which category this behavior fits in and where on this spectrum of sexual harassment that behavior that you're being targeted with fits. The first category of sexual harassment is threatening. So with this type of behavior, an individual in a company, usually someone with power, so a manager or a supervisor, threatens the employment or the continued employment of another individual unless sexual services are provided, the person goes on a date and does whatever is requested. And then there's another twist on this one, that the supervisor or manager could imply that, you know what, if you do this for me, if you provide these sexual services, then you'll get a promotion or you'll get a raise. So threatening is that first category. The next category is physical harassment. So this is a range of behaviors that involve physical touch. So it could be simply touching someone on the shoulder or brushing up against them, leaning over them, to making sure that that person is touched, to blocking their way. So for example, if you need to go this way and someone's standing there and you have to go around them, or you have to touch them in order to get around, that's also physical harassment. So any type of behavior with sexual intent, that sexual intent has to be there as a component, that involves physical touch that is unwanted, falls into this category. The next category is verbal harassment, and this is exactly what it sounds like. So this ranges from calling the individual babe or honey or sweetheart, catcalling, whistling, flirting, putting lots of sexual innuendo into conversations, all the way up to repeatedly asking an individual out on a date and not taking no for an answer. The next category is nonverbal harassment. So this includes everything from excessive staring or ogling or leering to winking to any obscene gestures, to giving someone gifts, repeatedly giving gifts that are not wanted. So nonverbal harassment is all of the body language and gesturing and gestures that indicate sexual intent. The final category is environmental harassment, and this includes anything in the environment that kind of conveys this sexual intent and or sexual threat. So it could be pictures of men or women in suggestive positions. It could be clothing that has suggestive comments on it. It could be music that has a very heavy sexual intent or sexual content to it. So anything in the environment that kind of sexualizes the environment or puts this heavy sexual intent into the environment falls into this category. As with other challenging interactions in the workplace, whether a behavior gets defined or categorized as sexual harassment or not very often does rest with the person being targeted by that behavior. So we could have 2 individuals targeted with the same behavior, and one perceives it as sexual harassment and one doesn't. And it really comes down to, is the behavior wanted? So if it's unwanted behavior with sexual intent, then it's sexual harassment. But if it's wanted and the person doesn't see it as a threat, or the person just doesn't care, then it would not be perceived as sexual harassment. So that's kind of the gray area here. So once again, there's a series of questions that you can ask yourself in order to determine, is this behavior that's being targeted at me sexual harassment, and therefore am I going to do something about it to get it to stop? So the first question is, does the behavior have clear sexual overtones or sexual intent? Here's a really important one. Does the behavior make me feel uncomfortable? Does the behavior make me feel threatened? Is the behavior intimidating or belittling to me as the recipient? Does the behavior devalue me as a person? Would I want another woman, my friend, my daughter, my sister, subjected to this behavior? This set of questions is really helpful in order for you to determine if you are being targeted with sexual harassment or not. And if you determine, yes, it is sexual harassment, then you can start to implement the strategies that we've already talked about so that the behavior can stop. The final behavior that we're going to look at in more depth is workplace violence, Workplace violence has been receiving more and more attention over the years, so much so that in 2010, the Ontario government added a special amendment to the Occupational Health and Safety Act in order to specifically address workplace violence. So we're going to take a look at what was added in that amendment and the implications of that if you are being targeted by workplace violence in terms of how you can manage it. Let's take a look at how workplace violence is defined under the amendment to the Occupational Health and Safety Act. There are three kind of categories of workplace violence that are defined in the Act. The first category is an obvious one. This is the exercise of actual physical force against an individual in the workplace that did result in physical harm or could result in physical harm to that individual. So physical force is kind of what comes to mind when we think of violence, and that's the first category. The next category is an attempt to exercise physical force. So the person tries to be physically forceful with another individual, but is somehow blocked from doing that by other people in the workforce or by that individual himself or herself. So an attempt to exercise physical force is also workplace violence. And then finally, workplace violence is also a statement or a behavior that implies intent to physically harm an individual in the workplace. And so this is anything from, a verbal threat, I'm going to kill you, I'm going to punch you out, I'm going to punch your head in, to any behavior that would indicate that that's what's going to happen. So the threat of violence also falls under this definition of workplace violence. The Act also very clearly spells out what should happen in the case of workplace violence. So it spells out what companies need to do in situations with workplace violence and what employees need to do in these situations as well. It also spells out when there's a refusal to work, when there's the right to refuse to work. So for example, if an individual is being targeted by workplace violence, he or she has the option to refuse to work. So the Act spells out situations in which workers or employees have that right to say, I am not working anymore. And then the final piece that the Act spells out is that employees or individuals are free from reprisals if they have concerns about workplace violence that they then bring to their employer. So their employer can't then turn around and fire them or penalize them in some way. So the Act is very thorough in terms of how both employers and employees should deal with workplace violence. Another benefit to the clear definitions of workplace violence that are in the Occupational Health and Safety Act is that employers have very clear guidelines in terms of what their responsibilities are. So employers are responsible for having policies in place both to prevent workplace violence and how to deal with workplace violence when it does occur. They've got very clear guidelines in terms of how to communicate those policies to their employees and how to implement those policies. So there's a training component in there as well, and there's a communication component. So employers are given very, very clear guidelines about how to prevent workplace violence and how to manage it. The Occupational Health and Safety Act does provide really clear support for individuals who are being targeted by workplace violence. So if you are in that position, use the law, use your organization's or your employer's responsibilities under the law to get the issue resolved immediately. And to state the obvious, if the workplace violence immediately endangers your life, you just go to the police, because first of all, you have to protect your own life, and then you can get the other issues dealt with. If you recall the categories of sexual harassment, there was this one category called environmental harassment. And this, if you recall, is just where different objects and posters and visual images in the environment create a sexually threatening environment for the individuals there. This leads into the next topic that we're going to talk about, and the kind of the final way that we can try to manage challenging interactions in the workplace, and that is to take a really big picture look at what's going on in your work environment and identify areas where that work environment can just be made safer, and safer for everyone, not just yourself, but every individual in there. So how can the overall work environment be made safer for all of the people who work there? Here are just a few ideas that your organization or your company can implement in order to create a safe workplace for all employees so that these challenging interactions are minimized or don't even occur. So the first one is training. So training is a huge component of creating a safe work environment. So the company can provide training for all employees on the different legislation that covers these challenging interactions, the company's policies towards these interactions, and just how to manage these interactions as an individual. So training is a huge component of creating a safe environment. The next strategy for creating a safe work environment is a communication strategy. So communicate, communicate, communicate. So employees should have access to the company's policies on different challenging interactions, for example, workplace harassment, sexual harassment, workplace violence. There should be easy access to all of those policies by all employees. So this can be putting posters up on the walls, making sure the policy documents are easily accessible. So communicate, communicate, communicate is another strategy to get that workplace environment safe. Another strategy is to actually include challenging interactions as part of an employee's performance appraisal document and the performance appraisal system. So the employer can add a section to performance appraisals that deals with challenging interactions. So they can address things like communicating respectfully to colleagues, treating colleagues with respect, being mindful of the viewpoints of others. So there are a lot of criteria that can be put into performance appraisals so that employees know, you know what, I'm being held accountable to these standards for interacting with my colleagues. And if I don't uphold these standards or I don't meet these standards, it will impact my promotions and it will impact my pay raises. So kind of cut to the bottom line here, put it into performance appraisals so that employees take it seriously. And it also demonstrates that employers take it seriously as well. The next strategy is a monitoring strategy. Managers in organizations or employers in organizations can just kind of do walkarounds in the work environment and just make sure that nothing inappropriate or threatening or with overt sexual intent is being posted around the workplace. So even in people's cubicles, there shouldn't be inappropriate posters and things like that. So, you know, having managers just do walkarounds every once in a while and checking that the environment just appears safe and is not threatening any particular individuals, that's another good strategy. And finally, employers and managers and supervisors can have ongoing discussions with staff about what a safe work environment looks like and feels like. So these discussions can be part of staff meetings, they can be part of informal conversations, but just getting people talking about, you know what, this is what a safe work environment looks like and feels like, and hey, how are we doing, is another way just to keep the issue front and center with all of the people in the workplace. These strategies all take a preventative approach, and the preventative approach is the best approach to take because you want everyone to be a win-win. You want all of your employers and all of your colleagues, you want everyone in this workplace to have a good time working. We spend a lot of time in the workplace, so if we're going in there and we're feeling threatened and we're just feeling uncomfortable, life isn't very pleasant. So when we're preventative and proactive about this as employers and managers and supervisors, it has a huge impact on staff performance and employee retention. So these are great strategies to put into place to create safe work environments and to help your employees be successful and feel comfortable in their workplaces. It's time for you to get to work. We've given you a lot, and I do mean a lot of information about challenging interactions in the workplace. Take a few minutes to go back through the handout, and if you want, go back to key parts of the video just to refresh your memory about the information we've provided. Then evaluate your own current situation, either individually or evaluate your workplace. What are 3 actions that you can take in the next 4 months in order to address issues of challenging interactions with colleagues? So what are 3 things that you want to put into place right now? By right now, I mean in the next 4 months, that will impact you and make you feel safer, make your work environment more enjoyable. So use the information we provided you, apply it to your current situation, and create an action plan for yourself so that you can put this into play in your own life. We've given you additional resources and references in case you want to delve into any of the topics that we've covered in more detail. The references and resources fall into two categories. So first of all, any links that you see, these are links to the actual legislation that we've talked about. All of the legislation is publicly available online, so if there is legislation you want to look at in more detail, the references and the links are there. Then we've also provided you with some books that you might want to add to your personal library. And these are books that provide proactive and preventative strategies as well as management strategies should you be targeted with any of these challenging interactions. Here's a quick recap of what we covered. We started by talking about why it's important to be aware of challenging workplace interactions in the first place. So how does this impact us as we do our work? Then we looked at different definitions for challenging interactions. So we looked at definitions for discrimination and harassment and so on. Then we looked at some basic strategies to use if you are being targeted with these challenging interactions. So we looked at just an overall strategy, we looked at a communication strategy called the STOP technique, and we looked at the strategy of being assertive. Then we delved into some of these behaviors in more detail. So we looked at workplace harassment in more detail, we looked at sexual harassment in more detail, and we looked at violence in more detail. Then we looked at a preventative strategy that all companies can employ, and that is the strategy of creating a safe work environment for everyone. Then we put you to work developing an action plan, and finally we gave you some additional resources if you want to delve into these topics in more detail. Hopefully you found this information really useful. If you are being targeted by these types of behaviors, please use this information and these strategies so that the behaviors stop. One final word. Don't ever, and I mean ever, allow these challenging interactions to derail your career, slow your career down, or throw you off the career path altogether. If these interactions are being directed at you, use the strategies and information we provided to get them to stop so that they don't affect your career. You're too hardworking, you're too capable to allow the behaviors of others to stop you from building the rewarding career for yourself that you want.